Good morning, Mosaic. The story I'm about to tell you is a story I really like telling. It happened a while ago. I've told it a lot of times, and it's a little different each time. But what's unique about it in my life and in my family's life is that it continues to morph. It's like that song that never ends. So today I'm going to tell you a story about meat bees, about a wise dog, about the power of prayer, about a couple of angels, and a very good God, and a very serious heart attack. So that's what we're going to do today. A little over 5 years ago, on September 11th, 2019, my wife and I were getting away for a belated anniversary weekend. And we decided to go to Tahoe, stopped on the way up, bought lunches in Truckee, and we're going to hike, have lunch, and then spend the night and get back to town. We did that. Some of you have maybe walked this trail before at Tahoe. It's very beautiful. I would recommend it. It's called the Picnic Rock Viewpoint. It's on the Tahoe Rim Trail. It's rated as moderately challenging. It's a 3-mile out and back and has a great view of Lake Tahoe, almost like being up in a helicopter. And it's in an elevation of 7,800 feet. So we hiked to the top and had lunch. And that's when the meat bees came into the story. They were all over the place at Picnic Rock. I guess that's why they hung out there, because that's where all the picnics were. At any rate, they were all over my roast beef and Julie's turkey sandwich. And so we had to eat lunch and kind of hop around and swat these guys away. But we finally got it done. And we're near the end of our lunch when one of the meat bees flew up Julie's pant leg and stung her. Now, Julie is very allergic to insect bites. So we knew right away we had to get off that hill and get down fast. So she popped a Benadryl, and we packed up and started really hustling down. Lots of switchbacks, pretty steep. So it was then, as we were hustling down the hill, that I started to have strange feelings. I had lightheadedness, I had a slight heartburn in my sternum area, and weirdly enough, I was yawning a lot. So I told Julie, I had to stop. I was getting dizzy, and we did. And I sat there for a minute or two and felt better, and we need to get down the hill. And so I got up and we continued. Well, that happened twice. The third time, I said, we've got to stop. We could actually see my truck, but with the switchbacks and whatnot, we were probably maybe 2 or 3 football fields distance from the truck. And so I was sitting on this log and dizzy. She asked me, can you go? And I said, I can't. And her next question to me was, do you need me to call 911? And I said, yes. So this dizziness got more persistent, and I laid down. I said, I need to lay down, and that helped. So I laid down on the trail, and I never really gave much thought to what the structure or the duration or the content might be for the last prayer that I would ever make on earth. And so I prayed. Maybe a little segue here. My background, I'm retired now. I worked 30 years in IT, and maybe half of that was with Verizon and AT&T. And I'm very familiar with cellular networks. And my primary responsibility was working with the Western US states for their 911 emergency communication centers. So I knew the limitations that the 911 system had with the terrain that we were hiking in. So Julie dialed 911, and I could hear the phone ring and the dispatcher answer. And then the call dropped. she redialed, and this time the call stayed up. And the dispatcher automatically, when a call comes in, the location of the call precedes the actual voice discussion. So what she's supposed to get is when she picks up and says 911, what's your emergency? She has in front of her on her computer mapping system your location. And they triangulate that off towers and whatnot. But because of the terrain, it was impossible to do that. So she couldn't see us. Julie tried to explain to her where we were, but the dispatcher just wasn't understanding. So the good news was really bad news because I knew the situation I was in. There is a first responder thing that called the golden hour. And that's the period of time that they need to have an intervention when someone's having a heart attack so that the percentage or likelihood of survivability and quality of life after the heart attack is increased. So once that event happens, the clock starts ticking. And with this disconnect that was going on with the 911 center, I was realizing that this was not going well and could end badly. So I prayed. And that prayer, in retrospect, was very short, ridiculously short. And the more I looked into it later on, I learned that in crisis and chaos, when anxiety is high, prayer is primarily always pretty simple. So I fit that category well. And essentially what I asked was, Lord, if it's your will that you save me, or if it's your will that you take me home, I'm okay with that. And I just surrendered. And surrendering, I've heard about it and read about it, but it's something that's hard to practice. I mean, that's when you're all in and you just give it up. So 2 to 3 minutes later, and I'll say that again, 2 to 3, I think you say circle underline.
Yeah, circle highlight. Circle highlight.
Circle highlight, thank you. Anyway, it was that quick. God answered my prayer. Now, God always answers prayers. It's yes, no. Really, the question is, what's the duration for the answer? It can be, ongoing. It can be relatively fast. But someone once said that God is never late. He's never too early. He's always exactly at the right time, and it's his time. So up the trail comes a man and a woman, and they see me laying on the trail, obviously a little bit of a roadblock. They ask Julie if I'm okay, and could they help? Could I get that picture put up? Okay, so this is Annie and Bryce and their sidekick, Frankie. And that, by the way, is the view from, if you look behind them, the view from Picnic Rock. So it's really nice. But anyway, Annie and Bryce are traveling nurses. Annie is an ICU cardiac nurse, and Bryce is an emergency room nurse. So Annie immediately started working on me, and Bryce went to help Julie. Now these guys had just moved into the Reno area. They hadn't even started their jobs. They were starting the following Monday, so they were just out for a hike, and God sent them, to help me, and sent them quickly. So I had an immediate answer to my prayer. Bryce helped Julie he got his Google Maps out. It showed the location where we were. He hit the pin and it popped the X, Y, or the coordinates of where we were. And I heard him read these 12-digit numbers to the dispatcher. And I heard her say, "We see you." So it was such a relief. Now, right after I said my prayer too, I had this immense feeling of calm come over me. It was like the peace of God that transcends all understandings. That's in the promise in Philippians. I mean, that actually happened. So I just knew I was going to be all right. And so I heard in about a minute or two later a siren. And you hear sirens all the time in our life, but that was my siren. So it was really sweet. Bryce ran down the steep trail to meet them at the trailhead, and they saw what a big guy he was, so they handed him the defibrillator to carry up the hill. Anyway, up at the top, when they got to me, they hooked me up and confirmed the diagnosis. They strapped me into a interesting stretcher that had one big fat tire on the bottom of it that was kind of flat, and they bounced me down the hill to the ambulance. And that was the last we saw of these guys. And all we really had at that point in time was Annie's first name. So they were there, they saved me, she worked on me, we went down the hill, and that was it. And I was in the here and now with the EMTs down at the trailhead. So they tossed me in an ambulance, and we were actually, for those of you that know the area, we were on 267, probably between the Tahoe Truckee Airport and the lake, we were like probably 2/3 of the way down. And the trailhead's right on the road where you can take the Tahoe Rim Trail down or you can take it up. Well, we were up. I heard them call ahead for helicopter evacuation. So there was nowhere to land this helicopter, so they had to race me to the airport, and that's where they were going to load me on the helicopter to take me to the hospital. On the way, I heard the guy driving the ambulance, because the window was open, the radio came in, and they said that the helicopter wasn't available. They went out to spin it up for me, and it had a mechanical issue, so they couldn't use it. So the driver said, "Hold on, we're going to Reno." Well, now ambulances are not aerodynamic. Matter of fact, if you've noticed, most of them look like a loaf of bread. And on the inside, if you've ever looked in there, they have those grab bars. And so I was in there with like 3 EMTs, and they were holding on for dear life as we maneuvered the mountain roads to try to get as fast as we could because of that golden hour window to Reno. I actually thought I was going to have a concussion on top of the problems I already had. But finally I arrived, and I was met by we were at Renown Hospital in Reno, which is a teaching cardiac hospital. So we went into the emergency bay. I was greeted by their triage team, and the EMTs wheeled me in, and this nurse jumped up on the gurney I was on, straddled me, and cut my best Orvis shirt off me. And that was actually the most out of sorts I was the whole day. That really bothered me that she would ruin my new Orvis shirt. At any rate, they undid the EMT's leads, plugged their ozone in, and off I went into the hospital. So they took me to their heart catheter lab and put me under. I had 2 stents put in my right coronary artery, which was 90% blocked. When I came to, the doctor told me that my other 2 heart arteries were 70 and 80% blocked, but I had AFib in the procedure room twice, and they had to shock my heart back into its normal rhythm. So they didn't want to do the other stents and wanted me to chill out and calm down, and then they would go back in and do those. So I did stabilize, but I was 3 more days in the ICU, cardiac ICU at Renown. So finally I had smoothed out my heart rhythm, and they were going to go back in and do these other 2 arteries. And they wheeled me down into the procedure room, where I was greeted by a Shawn Mendes song. So it was blaring in the procedure room. The nurses were dressed in what looked like hazmat suits, dancing around the room, prepping it for them and for me. This time they did the stents while I was awake. And in comes this doctor, and he's also dressed up in this, I could only see his eyes, and he introduced himself and says, I'm the guy that did the 2 stents the other day, and pats me on the arm and says, don't worry, I can do these in my sleep. So anyway, listening to Shawn Mendes, I watched him do it. So 5 days later, 5 stents later, on the Sunday, so this happened on Wednesday, on the Sunday, I went home. Julie took me home. And, you know, I was weak like a puppy for a while, but after a month or 2, I started feeling better. So I wrote a couple of thank you letters. I wrote one to the EMTs because they didn't know if I died. I mean, they handed me off and they were gone. And I wrote one for Renown Hospital because I had got some fabulous care there. Well, this letter went into the organization at Renown and kind of pachinko balled down through the departments till it landed at the cardiac ICU, and it ended up on the employee lounge corkboard. In December, Annie and Bryce had started that Monday their new jobs at Renown. Wow. And they went to look for me, but I wasn't there because I went home Sunday. So they didn't know if I'd made it either. In December, which was, you know, this happened in September, so a few months later, when this letter finally shows up, she sees it during a break and says, hey, that's us. Annie and her family are all in the, it's like a genetic thing. She has 5 sisters. They're all in the medical profession, from a pharmacist to a nurse anesthesiologist to helicopter emergency nurse. Her dad's the head of urology at a hospital in Kansas City. I mean, they're all into it. And she's well aware of the HIPAA laws. And so it wouldn't be, you know, appropriate for her to contact us. So she called her mom, and her mom said, well, what would you do if it was one of your sisters? Anyway, a few days later, Julie received a Facebook Messenger conversation from Annie, and that's when things really took off. So we met them in Truckee and had sushi, had a 3-hour dinner, and shared perspectives. They told us stuff that we didn't know. We told them stuff that we didn't know. I didn't even notice Frankie when I was lying on the trail. And what Annie told me was that Frankie came and laid next to me while I was on the trail. And I'll tell you more about Frankie a little bit later. But our friendship, I mean, we're old enough to be their parents. And these young kids, we just blossomed with them, and our friendship continued to grow. We had them over to our house, and they came down, and we had them over our house a couple of times in Meadow Vista for dinner. The first time they came, they brought Frankie, and Frankie jumped out of the car, ran down to me, and sat on my feet. Oh. So I kind of like this dog. And later that year, Bryce proposed to Annie. And we were invited to their wedding in Kansas City, which we attended. And then they asked me to officiate their wedding. Mm. So if you could put the other picture up. You can see they clean up pretty good. Wow. So that's how this is a much condensed version. Anyway, how did all this affect me? And I'm going to have to go to my notes on this. I found as time created distance from the heart attack that prayer and reflection created some clarity for my impatient, unanswered questions. Life and time in general became more fragile. My wife, my children, my grandchildren have become more precious to me than they already were. It changed my perspective. It taught me to live in God's gift of the moment, to listen to my body more when it's telling me things, and to be thankful for every extra day that He provides. My son and 3 daughters had rushed to Reno to support Julie and I saw in their eyes deep concern, uncertainty, and worry. It was really a hard time for everybody. And I realized that a heart attack or a significant medical event, it doesn't just happen to you, it happens to the whole family. It's a life changer for everyone. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and I belong to other people, and I'm responsible to them. And I saw God do His thing. He used those meat bees to hustle us down that mountain. If I'd have had that heart attack up at the top and all the trouble with the, probably it had better cell reception, but the distance the EMTs would have had to come, that golden hour would have been really pushing the envelope, especially with the helicopter not working. So He used meat bees to get us off the top and down fast. He used Frankie in a really unique way. That trailhead, you can go up, and go west and go up, or you can go kind of down and go east. They didn't know the area, and so they got out of the truck and hadn't decided which way to go, and Frankie went up. So they followed the dog. And that brought them on the trail segment that I was on. The other thing was the piece I was talking about. And it was a noticeable piece because when we were at dinner in Truckee, Annie mentioned that she'd never worked on anybody with a heart attack that had the calm and the peace that I did. She said it was really weird. And I thanked her for that. And what have I learned so far? And it's certainly ongoing, the things I'm learning, but God by definition is way bigger and understanding than my desires. And so it makes sense that I won't be able to understand everything that such a big God does or doesn't do. What was God's plan then and now? And how does this perfect will play out here? I don't know. But if you can't imagine a good reason why God would allow something to happen, it doesn't mean there can't be one. I learned that when you reach for God, when I prayed on that trail, that little itty bitty, silly, short, not very eloquent prayer, you reach God. And that He's open for business 24/7. He's a good listener. And I've learned that God's not through with me, my family, and the people that have been involved in this. Bryce, over our dinner in Truckee, had expressed a desire to maybe do a career change. He'd been in emergency room for like 8-9 years and wanted to be a fireman ever since he was a little boy, but had not had the courage or whatever to make that change. And he talked about how he'd been abused in the ER by people. He'd had knives pulled on him, he'd been punched at, he hadn't got thank yous. And while he liked the ER part of it, the other part he didn't like. And he broke down and cried while we had dinner. Well, since then, Bryce has become an EMT fireman. And so they've gone through some changes as well as a result of this incident. Appropriate for this being Super Bowl Sunday too, is I learned that God has a great sense of humor. Not one necessarily I appreciate, but He has a great sense of humor. He had demonstrated a touch of irony when he had a lifelong 49er fan, 4th grade, John Brody, I mean that long, saved by Kansas City fans. Annie's family is wacko. They are sold out Kansas City fans. They have 15 to 20 friends and family over every game day. They barbecue, they do probably 1,200 ribs. And they have flags and they paint their lawn.
Oh, wow. Wow.
I mean, these are, like I said, wackos. So I did bump into God's sense of humor there. At the wedding, it was about 200 people. And most of the people at the wedding were familiar with this story, but, and no offense, they just thought I was the pastor. And after dinner, when they found out, I went to the rehearsal. I'll back up just a little bit. So when I went to the rehearsal, you know, I was ready for the ceremony and all that. And Annie's mom came up and said, "Can you pray over dinner, after we get to the reception?" I said, "Sure, I could do that." And she goes, "Oh, and I want you to share your story with Annie and Bryce." I said, "Oh, no. This is their day. No." And they would have none of it. So I had to hustle back to the hotel, try to compress this thing, and I have compressed it a lot for you. There was a lot more that went on, but I had to compress this thing. So I show up at the reception, and everybody, we've gone through the toasts, and people are getting up and they're doing everything off their iPhone, and I'm the only one with a 4x6 index card. So I started, and I lost it. I got too emotional, and I got like 2 sentences into it. I couldn't go on. And across the large room we were in, Annie and Bryce were at the wedding table, and they both got up and walked across the room, and Annie put her arm around me. Julie got up and came and supported me, and I was able to push through it. Needless to say, grace was a lot easier. But after the meal, people came up to us and said to the effect that, "So you're the one." And we told them, no, God was the one. Anyway, thank you for listening today.